Good afternoon. Welcome to Friday morning, as it was on the slide. It's a pleasure to have another round of SEEtalk talks. This time we focus on election security. This is the day for security, so we focus on election security now. And I have a great guest today. That's Dave Leichtman. He's a director of strategic projects at Microsoft Defending Democracy program. Dave, welcome. From somewhere over the ocean, and good morning to you.
Thank you.
I'll just mention that Dave works as a part of the Microsoft's digital diplomacy efforts. He assists campaigns with security and technology and works with election officials in the US and internationally. There's a number of questions. We don't have much time, but I do want to start with a little bit unusual question. Skimming through your bio, I've noticed that you actually have a Master of Science in Particle Physics, yet you do have quite some footprint in computer or technology and policy, if we wish. How do you explain that, if you can?
It's funny. Everybody thinks that particle physics is exploring the mysteries of the universe and searching deep for deep philosophical answers, and it's really all about programming simulations in a basement. So particle physics is pretty much computer science as far as anyone doing it is concerned.
Yet it's interesting that big part of your work is actually not only technology. It's much about democracy, policy, the social aspects of the topic. So that's again an interesting combination.
Yeah, I'll say our whole team, the whole Defending Democracy team at Microsoft has both a tech and a politics background. We all came to this team from outside of Microsoft, mostly with backgrounds in political tech and the intersection of the two, which is a fairly new field. I mean, it's something that just didn't exist 15 years ago.
That's true. I mean, even the very appearance of digital diplomacy sector, if you wish, in Microsoft is quite an unusual. And I think if there is any message from this junction between technology and policy and different profiles, probably for the young people interested in technology and policies, that it doesn't really matter what sort of background you might have. I think the passion is what you need for this topic, and certainly you show that. Let's move to the discussion about the election. So basically, I'll start with understanding what the elections are, and certainly we are not looking only at the last moment when we vote. It's the end of one election cycle and probably the beginning of the next one. But it's a complex process of a long time, even years, if not continuous, right? And there are a lot of cyber risks which are basically involved with the process, the ways that someone can influence the process through cyber means. So looking throughout the process, from shaping the public opinion to the results, what are the risks? I know you don't have time much, and you would probably spend 2 hours in explaining.
Sure.
Try to do an essence of that.
Yeah, and actually, just to say it, when it comes to the U.S. elections, because so much of it has moved to vote by mail, most states are pushing out ballots right now. My ballot is sitting on my kitchen counter. 45 days out is pretty much the date. So we're in the middle of the election right now. Like you said, there's no hard and fast date anymore. We're expecting something like 50% of all votes to come in through the mail this year because of COVID. And so the election is ongoing right now. And also to your point, I mean, because so many of the votes aren't going to be cast on election day in a polling location, it's going to take a long time to count them. I mean, we will have 100 million, not 100 million, some 120 million votes, something like that. And, those will take maybe 2 weeks to count them all. So ensuring resiliency of results reporting, I think that's probably going to be one of the most important, if not the most important aspect of this election this year in the US. We've got a president who is openly saying, as of yesterday, that he will have to wait and see if he accepts the results of the election. So the counting process and the 2 weeks after election day are going to be so critical, because there's a real possibility, just given the political inclination of who votes by mail versus who shows up in person, that the president could be winning on election day and then not winning 2 weeks later once all the votes are counted. And so ensuring that the results and counting process are transparent and thoroughly accessible and visible and open are of absolute critical importance.
And if you look into this end, let's say the end phase of it's not just the voting, right, the casting the votes, but also calculating the results and publishing the results and all of that. What is the most fragile component, at least when you look at the US elections? You have a little bit of specific circumstances compared to many other countries. You also have the voting machines, and now it's a combination of mail-ins and so on. What is maybe the most fragile aspect of that when it comes to cyber influence?
It's interesting that we have a system which could be viewed as either a bug or a feature, to use computer science parlance. Here in the US, there is no federal election. We do not hold an election at the national level. We have 51 individual state elections held to determine the president and the federal offices. And each state runs their own elections. In some states, each county runs their own elections. There are 9,000 elections jurisdictions in the United States, each of them running their own election. That's fragile in itself, right? I mean, it presents a myriad of attack vectors. You've got 9,000 different attack vectors, each of which different tech systems, different physical processes and vulnerabilities. So from a foreign adversary's perspective, it's green field. There's so much to attack, you could attack anything. Flip it around, it could be a feature. There's so much to attack that where do you start? If you're a foreign adversary looking to actually, say, influence the results of an election, you'd have to know exactly where to target and when and how, and it's just the return on investment isn't there, right? So what we tend to see, and you and I had talked about this before, is we haven't seen a lot of targeting of elections infrastructure, and that's a good thing. But we have seen a lot of targeting of the political process that leads up to it. So we talk about the things that go into election security. It's the maintaining of lists, it's the actual voting, it's the reporting out of results. But then there's also all the things that go on around it, the political parties, the political campaigns, the think tanks that provide policy. And we've seen foreign adversaries going strongly after the political process and the personal accounts of people participating in the political process because they're easier attack vectors. And to the modus operandi of some of these foreign adversaries, they tend to go after personal information for the purposes of influence operations, right? They come in, they get my personal email, they dig up whatever they can, and then they dump it, they leak it in a strategic manner in order to destroy our trust in the democratic process.
So what you're saying basically is that besides targeting the voting itself, which is the lists and the machines and the calculation and all of that, there's a huge possibility of the influencing the elections before, not least with fake news, but also the leaks. And I think we've seen with the hacking of the Democratic Committee of the Democratic Party over there, and the leaks from Hillary Clinton, that the leaks can also influence the public opinion, I guess, as well. Huh?
That's right, and that's what we see on a foreign state actor level. That said, there's so many other things to be worried about. I think you guys had your own taste of criminal ransomware activity this week. That's honestly one of the things I worry about the most, right? We've seen city after city in the US get attacked by just commercial criminal ransomware. Entire cities shut down, entire hospital systems shut down. Imagine if a voter registration database in Texas is ransomwared the day before the election, what havoc that would cause on checking people in to vote and that kind of thing. So that's probably my second biggest worry is not foreign state actors attacking our infrastructure, but just criminal ransomware. And to the other part that you talked about, our voting infrastructure, like if you show up in person and vote in the United States, a lot of it's on machines, but those machines are air gapped and regulated as critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security. And the return on investment just isn't there in attacking them for the most part. The things on either side of that system, though, that we mentioned before, which is the maintaining of lists, the checking of people in, and then the reporting out of results, those are probably the most vulnerable pieces of the election apparatus on either side. And a lot of them are cloud-based, and so
if
potentially
there is,
more
if
prone
there's
to.
anything comforting in that, what you're saying is that the adversaries also have to think very well where to attack and how. It's not that easy. I mean, you can conduct various operations, but it costs, and then the results are not so easily foreseen. So that's a little bit comforting. Maybe stepping a little bit out of the US and looking into, let's say, the European elections. They're also quite broad for the parliament and so on. And we had some, information at least about various hacks, leaks, and so on. What are the different risks out of US in other parts of the world? And we'll focus in a minute specifically on developing countries.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. So I think, if you look at the world stage coming up, the German Bundestag elections are probably going to be the biggest thing happening after the US elections. We're also looking at some New Zealand votes in 4 weeks. And New Zealand is always a perennial target of attack from foreign state actors, especially China. But Germany is going to be a hot button. We know that Germany was attacked by foreign state actors actions which we attribute to Russia. Microsoft doesn't attribute to Russia. The United States intelligence community attributes that action to Russia, as does the German intelligence agencies. Their members of parliament were attacked, and some of their personal information was leaked strategically. Now, we expect to see a lot more of that in the lead up to the Bundestag elections coming up. But next year, 2021, is going to be a hot button for Eastern Europe. Half of the countries in Eastern Europe have elections in the next 12 months. And as we've seen, Russia considers Eastern Europe to still be its purview, right? And in some sense, maintaining democratic institutions as they exist in Eastern Europe is of absolute tantamount importance, because this is essentially the bulwark of world Western democracy against those who would not want it. Let's say that. So we plan to do quite a bit of work with Eastern European countries in the coming year.
I'll focus in a minute on developing countries and a particular aspect of that. But in the meantime, I wanted to share one of the polls, basically, with our participants. Let me see if I can manage to do that successfully. So that's a Mentimeter poll. I hope you can see it all. And I encourage you to grab your other browser, if you wish, or other device, and just try to vote there. So you can simply go to menti.com and type the code 2663129. And the question for you is, from the perspective of your own country, in a way, what are the elements of the election process that bear the biggest risk from cyber influence versus the biggest possible impact on the results? And you can scale any of these 5. Certainly there might be more. You can put in a chat if you have any other thoughts, but try to rate these 5 based on the level of risk from influence and level of impact. And Dave, in the meantime, I'm coming back to you with the question on, so looking at the developing countries and trying to make a parallel with, let's say, the US or even the EU. In most of developing countries, you have, first, you don't have the voting machines. You have a sort of the analog elections in a way. And most of the concerns is about the whole democratic process of the elections, about fair conditions, media freedoms, and so on, the pressures against voters and so on. But digitalization is, at least not of the election process, not the final part of the election process, not that advanced. So it's often thought that there are no risks when it comes to voting and elections and cyber influence in developing countries, Southeastern Europe being one of the regions that considers that. Yet, databases of all the results, basically, are stored in digital formats. The lists of voters are stored in digital formats, often on completely insecure computers or servers, which are taken for one-off occasion from somewhere, some of the offices and so on. So how are these risks different, or what could be your message to developing countries? What are the risks for election process there?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I think it's really important to realize that with the digitization of elections, and most of our elections, for instance, in the U.S. are, I'd say about half of states vote on something electronic. All states scan ballots on something electronic. All states publish their results on something electronic. But you look at New Zealand, and New Zealand votes entirely on hand-marked paper ballots that are hand counted. So I don't think it's necessarily a developing versus non. I think in a lot of developing countries, they actually tend to use what are called direct reporting electronic (DRE) devices, which just you push a button, it records your vote, and you walk away. That's actually the worst kind of voting, right? Because it's black box. You have no idea what happens to your vote afterwards. All of this is non-unique. The digitization of the voting process is simply a continuation of the ability to let's say stuff a ballot box digitally is the same as it is physically. I can pack votes, I can question results, I can just look at Belarus. It's all you have to do is stand up on a podium and say this was the result, and that was the result. So it's all about legitimacy. It's all about providing legitimacy, and there's different ways you do that. And when you're looking at digitization and how to ensure legitimacy, the two things that we stress are auditability and verifiability. So regardless of how your vote is cast, whether it's on paper, whether it's done through a ballot marking device like a machine that prints out your ballot, whether it's recorded directly at DRE, it doesn't really matter as long as you have those two components, auditability and verifiability. We have a big program at Microsoft called Election Guard, which we've been trying to work with international governments on implementing. It's a free open source cryptography project, but essentially bakes in a feature of verifiability. And verifiability means the ability to walk away from a voting booth or what have you with a piece of paper in your hand and a code that you can go look up afterwards and prove that your vote was counted in the election. We say counted as cast. So it was actually included in whatever tally is published. Auditability means that the ballot exists in some physical form afterwards. So even if you vote on a machine, it gets printed out and put in a box somewhere so that after the fact you can conduct, here in the US, we do a lot of things called risk limiting audits where you run them through a program. It tells you exactly which ballots to go back and retrieve. You make sure that a sampling of the ballots reflects the final results, and that's your audit trail. Then you can say, I know with 99.99 statistical probability that the election was true. So that's what we stress when we're talking about digitization.
And it's interesting also for the developing countries, and again, Southeastern Europe included, our countries in transition, is that the COVID-19 pandemic is pushing the thinking towards, in some countries which are to have the elections, I think it's Romania and some others, towards thinking about the online voting, introducing the online voting. And I don't know if you can give a good advice in a tweet-like form, but should we go for that or shouldn't we? Is it too risky or at the moment? Or?
It's an interesting question too. Look, in the United States, we hold a hard line advising against voting online. And part of the reason is proving identity. So there's two critical steps to voting. One is you prove your identity, and then you have a secret ballot. So when people say, oh, we can bank online, why can't we vote online? Because it's a totally different process, because it is a two-step process, one that is totally not anonymous, followed by a process that is totally anonymous. And the two have to be tied together but completely separated, and that's hard. That's really hard. So in the US, we don't have a national identity card of any kind. Therefore, we basically can't vote online safely and securely. The proving identity part is just beyond us. In countries where that's possible, I think online voting is fine. I think it's a perfectly acceptable alternative, as long as verifiability is baked in, right? And that's what we talked about before. People have to be able to take an artifact away from their vote that signals that their vote is somehow legitimate, that they can go back and verify that their vote was transmitted and correctly recorded. And that's the tricky bit. It's doable. I don't think most of the vendors who are out there talking about it right now are concentrating enough on that. They talk a lot about security, which is good and fine. We need security in our vote, right? You want to make sure that when your vote is transmitted, it is transmitted securely. But honestly, it's the verifiability piece of it that's critical. I want to be able to know after the fact that what I sent was the correct result.
And it's what you mentioned also when it comes to legitimacy. There were a couple of comments there. Tony mentioned in the chat any thoughts on using some kind of blockchain solution in voting, for example, in using it an extra layer on top of everything else to achieve verifiability? I'll go through the questions so you can reflect. Arvin mentioned that it's probably one of the worst ideas right now, voting online, I guess, particularly in developing countries where the system is missing. And Anna has raised her hand. I don't know, Anna, if you wish briefly to jump in with the audio.
No. I just wanted to read the questions.
Sure. Okay. So I took your job. Sorry for that. Okay.
So I'll say it's not the worst idea. Think about it this way. There are other things in an election. People talk about, like, the end goal of an election is to have a result that everybody in the democratic election agrees is the result, right? And there's lots of ways to achieve that. Security is a key way to achieve that, but it's not the only way. Accessibility and access are other ways, making sure that people who are disabled are able to vote, making sure that everybody who wants to vote can vote. And therefore, voting online isn't crazy. It actually increases the way that people can interact with their democracy. And that's a good thing. It just has to, there's lots of considerations that have to be made. Blockchain, I will refer you to the National Academies of Science report that was put out in the US 2 years ago. Our own senior cryptographer, Josh Benelo, wrote the section on why blockchain has no place in elections, none whatsoever. Blockchain is at its core a tracking solution, like cryptographic tracking, and votes should not be tracked. You do not want any kind of tying of the original identity to the anonymous vote, and therefore blockchain is reduced in an election scenario to simply a fancy form of cryptography, and there are other better fancy forms of cryptography to use in this situation.
So if once you can share the link either to me or if you managed to in the chat here. I mean, sort of added the question about vote buying in the sense of if there is a verifiability of votes, but he also confirmed that blockchain voting is an even worse idea. Any comment on vote buying?
You know, vote buying is a good point. So just to be clear, verifiability means that I can prove that my vote was counted as cast, but a verifiability tracker has no information about my actual vote in it. And that's absolutely critical, right? For that exact reason. So that, you know, if somebody asks me to prove I voted a certain way, I can't. But I can prove that I voted, and I can see that my vote was correctly tallied the way that I intended.
Taken into consideration.
Yeah.
Okay, we should wrap up in a minute or two. Let me take a look at the results. So we had about 10 people trying to somehow rate, and we see that fake news seem to be the top when it comes to both risk and impact, followed by calculation of votes. And then we have hacking of the voting machines and altering the registry of voters a little bit less. Leaks of sensitive documents are probably the least impactful and risky, but yet they are all above or in this most important quadrant. And probably the last question for you before wrap up is, you mentioned legitimacy. I think it is quite an important thing that even if there is a doubt that there was some sort of an interference with the election, and we have seen that around the legitimacy of the elections, even though nothing is true, can be questioned. Is there any way we can actually make sure that this doesn't impact, so even the leaks, I mean, even if the leaks are not right, not true, but the possibility that something has been done sort of puts a little bit of a shade on all of that.
This is hard, right? I mean, the foreign adversaries who want this are doing what's called flooding the zone. They're putting as much misinformation out as possible to prevent the transmission of what is true and what is correct. And honestly, just amplifying what is true and what is correct is of paramount importance here. I'll say to the results that I see down here, looks like everyone's concerned about everything, but the thing that ties all 5 of these things together is that they all serve a purpose. All of these are individual tactics to achieve an end goal, and that end goal is destroying our faith in democracy and attempting to delegitimize the results of the election. Each of these is an individual tactic, but in the end, their goals are all the same. So, just making sure that we put out the correct results, we have the correct results, that they are verifiable and auditable is the key.
I know we are running out of time. I'll just read the two questions, then you can probably wrap up with a brief reflection on that and what else we can maybe expect from Microsoft. One was from Katarina, who said, what about the people who don't have internet access? How will be their voice counted? And then there was a comment by Tony, physical voting booths are arranged in different areas during elections. So I assume that voting booths with computers could also be arranged. Any reflection on that?
Yeah, I mean, commitment to access is absolutely critical, right? Just making sure that people, if things are being done online, to make sure that people have access to a library where they can cast their vote, or a physical voting booth. Like physical voting booths still, even in states in the US where they do all mail-in voting, you can still go in and vote in person if you need to or want to, like Colorado or Washington State. I'll say, I think India does it the best. India has a commitment that if you want to vote, they have these little dumb boxes that are basically just counting boxes. But if you live in the middle of the jungle, there's a commitment from the Indian government that you only have to walk a mile, something like that, to get to a vote, to be able to vote, which means the Indian Elections Commission will bring one of those boxes to within a mile of your home in the middle of the jungle to make sure that you can vote. And that's beautiful. That's just making sure that everyone has access is absolutely critical.
So it seems like we can't avoid some sort of digitalization of the elections, which is probably both good and risky. And the final tweet from you, what can we expect from Microsoft in next steps when it comes to elections?
We've been working a lot with officials in the US on hardening systems. I think that next year, we're really going to shift our focus to Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, like I said before. I think it's critical to create a bulwark against those who would wish harm against democracy. So,
yeah. Dave, thanks a lot for joining us today. We are switching to the different room now, moving on with the discussion on risks in critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. So you're most welcome to join. Thanks a lot, and get some coffee. Good morning to you. And I invite everyone else to switch to the other room for the further discussion on cybersecurity. Thanks again for joining.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.